That night, the rain came down hard over Chicago. In a hidden alley behind the Halsted district, the most powerful man in the city was kneeling on the cold, wet concrete, the muzzle of a gun pressed against the back of his neck. Ronan Ashford, a name that made bankers sweat in air-conditioned rooms, a name the toughest men on the docks only dared to speak in whispers. And now, he was one squeeze of a trigger away from the end. His charcoal gray suit clung to his broad shoulders, soaked through with rain. 3 masked figures surrounded him, quiet, precise, the kind of men who had done this long enough to waste no words. They knew his schedule. They knew his route. They knew how to pull every bodyguard to the other side of the city with a single fake phone call, which meant whoever wanted him dead tonight came from the inside. "Any last words, Mr. Ashford?" The gunman's voice was flat and calm, like a man reading off an invoice. Ronan stared down at the puddle before him, where the red neon light blurred and trembled in the rain. More than 20 years building an empire only to end in an alley that smelled of wet garbage. A quiet laugh escaped him. Fate certainly knew how to pick its places. Then, from the dark corner of the alley, came a sound. Not a police siren, not the sound of rescue. It was the sound of a cardboard sheet being pushed aside. From a pile of discarded boxes, the 3 killers had walked past without a second glance. A woman slowly rose to her feet, brushing off the sleeves of a worn moss-green coat. Rain-soaked brown hair clung to her cheeks. She looked at the 3 gun barrels with calm, ash-gray eyes, as if all she saw were 3 puddles of rainwater. "You're making noise where I sleep." The nearest man let out a laugh and swung his gun toward her. It was the last thing he would ever manage to do that night. A few breaths. No more. By the time the neon light flickered for the 3rd time, all 3 masked men lay motionless on the concrete. Their guns scattered into the gutter, and the woman was already walking back to her corner, pulling her cardboard sheet into place, as if she had simply gotten up to shoo away a stray cat. Nothing more. Ronan Ashford stayed exactly where he knelt, rainwater running down the bridge of his nose. For the first time in all those years, the man could not find a single word. The boss who made all of Chicago bow its head had just been saved by a homeless woman this city had never once truly seen, though she had been there all along, every night, right before everyone's eyes. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why every record of her was blank, as if she had never existed in this world at all. And he could not yet know that the woman sleeping behind those cardboard boxes would be the reason his entire world would come crashing down, brick by brick, and then be rebuilt in a way he had never dared to dream. But that night, in the pouring Chicago rain, he knew only one thing. He owed her his life, and Ronan Ashford never forgot a debt. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories yet to come. The next morning, the rain from the night before remained only in scattered puddles along the harbor, but deep inside the wine cellar beneath the old row of warehouses, the air was colder than the rainy night itself. Ronan Ashford sat at the head of the long oak table, the charcoal suit he had changed into still sharply pressed, and around his wrist was an old mechanical watch, the only thing he wore that wasn't expensive, and the only thing he had never taken off in front of another person. Before him stood a middle-aged man named Ferris, his knees trembling so violently that everyone could hear the fabric of his trousers rubbing together. Ferris had managed the accounts for the Southern Warehouse District for 8 years, and throughout those 8 years, he had quietly siphoned away a portion of the shipment money, a little at a time, the petty theft of a man who believed no one would bother counting numbers that small. But in the Ashford organization, every number was counted. The cellar was so silent that they could hear water dripping from an old pipe somewhere in the darkness. More than 24 men stood along the walls on either side, all of them hardened faces from the harbor, yet not one dared to breathe too loudly. They were waiting for a gunshot. In this world, Ferris's crime had always ended in only one way. Ronan didn't look at Ferris. He looked at the watch on his wrist, slowly removed it, and placed it on the wooden table so gently that it didn't make a sound. Then he raised his eyes, and the cold steel blue of them sent Ferris collapsing fully to his knees. Ronan spoke in a voice no louder than the dripping water, telling him that from this moment forward, nothing Ferris possessed belonged to him anymore. Not his house, not his car, not the money in any of his accounts, not even his name in this city. Before the sun went down, Ferris was to leave Chicago, and no city within reach of the organization would ever again offer him a place to lay his head. Ferris lifted his tear-soaked face and stammered that he would rather be allowed to die, because he understood what this sentence meant. It meant living with nothing left to hold on to. Ronan rose, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and delivered one final sentence before turning away. He wanted Ferris to live with zero, to live with it for a very long time, just as Ronan himself once had. The entire cellar lowered its head as he passed. Not a single gunshot rang out that morning, but everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something more terrifying than bullets. They had seen a man who didn't need anger to punish, and didn't need blood to make an example of someone. That was why, after all these years, the Ashford name still stood firm over this harbor, among men who knew no language except their fists. Wade Corrigan was already waiting at the foot of the stairs, a black coat folded neatly over one arm, carrying the composed manner of a man who had walked behind his employer for 20 years. Corrigan was the only person permitted to approach Ronan without warning, the only one who knew the safe combinations, the schedules, and even the smallest habits, such as the fact that Ronan always drank his coffee without sugar and never sat with his back to a door. In everyone else's eyes, Corrigan was the perfectly loyal right-hand man, the shadow that never left the crime boss's side. The two men walked down the corridor, damp with the breath of the lake, and Ronan spoke without turning around, his voice returning to its usual coldness. He wanted two matters dug out by the roots. The first was the message from the night before, the one promising an old dossier connected to his father, the bait that had drawn him alone into the Halstead district like a fish biting down on a hook. Whoever had sent that message knew exactly where his only weakness lay. They knew that merely mentioning the two words Patrick Ashford would make even the most cautious man in Chicago leave every bodyguard behind. Whoever it was, they weren't an outsider. Corrigan nodded, not a trace of emotion disturbing his expression, calmly receiving the order as he had received thousands of orders over the past 20 years. The second matter made Ronan stop beside the car. His gaze turned toward the gray waters of Lake Michigan, and his voice slowed by half a beat. The woman in the moss-green wool coat from the Halstead alley. He wanted to know who she was. Corrigan replied that he had put people on it since midnight, but the results were so strange that even he found them difficult to believe. No identification papers, no social security number, no tax records, no banking history, not a single photograph in any system. The woman was completely blank, as though she had never been born into this world. Ronan remained silent for a long time. An ordinary man might hear that and assume she was simply a drifter whom no one had ever bothered to record. But Ronan had lived too long, in a world of secrets, to believe anything so simple. Poor people still left traces behind: an application for public assistance, a hospital admission, a police warning. Only names that had once touched something dangerous enough were erased this thoroughly, wiped away by professional hands, hands backed by official seals and authority. That emptiness wasn't nothing. It was a grave someone had taken great care to dig. Ronan climbed into the car and looked at his reflection in the darkened window, and for the first time in years, he felt something almost like curiosity. A woman whose name had been erased by the entire world had just saved the life of a man whose face the entire world was forced to remember. He gave the order quietly. Find her, at any cost, but don't let her know. The black car rolled away from the harbor, carrying an unpaid debt and two unanswered questions, while Ronan Ashford remained unaware that both answers would eventually lead him to the same address, an old red brick house standing humbly in the Halstead district, where the air smelled of baked goods, and a little bell chimed whenever someone pushed open the door. Less than half an hour's drive from Ronan Ashford's harbor, the Halstead district welcomed the morning in its own way, with shopkeepers rattling up their metal shutters, the smell of roasting coffee mingling with steam rising from the still wet pavement, and hurried crowds pouring toward the elevated train stations with their collars turned high. Amid that current of people, at the mouth of an alley behind the row of storefronts, the woman in the moss-green wool coat carefully folded her sheet of cardboard, tied it into a small roll, hid it behind a large trash bin, and sat down on the cold stone steps of a shuttered building. Over the past 7 years, Delaney Ward had learned the rules by which invisibility worked. People didn't hate her. They didn't chase her away. They simply didn't see her. The eyes of passers-by always slid past the place where she sat as though she were a lamppost, a fire hydrant, some object permanently attached to the sidewalk. One mother pulled her child along a little faster when they passed. One gentleman stood directly in front of her for a long time, talking on his phone about his second vacation home by the lake. never once lowering his eyes. Long ago, in another life, invisibility had been her most valuable weapon, something forged through punishing training and traded for survival. Now it was merely the sentence this city carried out upon her every day, without a courtroom, without a verdict, and she had stopped resisting it a long time ago. She ate when she found food, slept when the weather allowed it, and never spoke to anyone for more than 2 sentences, because the third sentence was always a question, and questions led back to the past, a place she would never return to again. That afternoon, while Delaney sat with her back against the brick wall behind the market, a scent reached her before the sound of footsteps did. The smell of chicken soup simmered with celery and thyme, a warmth so tender it was almost painful to someone who had spent too long breathing, nothing but exhaust fumes and the stench of wet garbage. Then a pair of worn canvas shoes stopped directly in front of her, and a steaming bowl of soup was placed carefully and neatly on the stone step, along with a spoon wrapped in a clean paper napkin. Delaney looked up and found herself meeting the warm brown eyes of an elderly woman whose silver hair was gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, whose blue apron was still dusted with flour, and whose small frame stood with the steady strength of someone who had spent 70 years on those feet without ever bowing to anyone. Then the old woman said something that brought Delaney's entire world to a halt. She said, "Delaney, it's colder today than it was yesterday. Eat while the soup is still hot. Not hey, you, not the woman on the corner. Her name, her real name, spoken clearly and gently, as though it were a name worth saying aloud." Delaney's hand trembled as she accepted the bowl, the first time her hand had shaken in 7 years, and she had to lower her eyes to hide what was rising inside them. She later learned that the old woman had noticed her weeks before, had asked the newspaper vendor at the end of the street and the man who cleaned the church, slowly piecing together the name its own owner had abandoned. The old woman sat down beside her on the stone step, slowly and naturally, as though sitting beside an old acquaintance, then introduced herself as Dorothy Mercer, though everyone in the neighborhood called her Miss Dot. She added that her restaurant was 2 blocks away, that every afternoon there were always a few bowls of soup left over, and that letting them go to waste would be a terrible shame. Delaney finished the soup in silence, and when she tried to return the bowl, Miss Dot rose, brushed the flour from her apron, and told her she could bring it back to the restaurant and have dinner while she was there. That was how she drew Delaney into the Blue Finch, not through pity, but through a small excuse that allowed the person receiving kindness not to feel indebted. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a red brick building more than 100 years old, 3 stories tall, with white painted window frames flaking in places, and a wooden sign bearing a faded blue finch, worn pale by years of rain and sun. Inside were mismatched wooden tables, comfortably cluttered and warm like a grandmother's kitchen. On the wall beside the cash register hung a small chalkboard, handwritten in white chalk, its message retraced many times over the years. No one leaves through that door with an empty stomach. That evening, when Delaney hesitantly asked why she would do such a thing for a stranger, why she had gone to the trouble of learning the name of someone who lived behind a trash bin, Miss Dot stopped polishing the glass in her hands, looked at her through the steam rising from the sink, and answered in the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking about such things. "People aren't invisible because they're poor, child. They're invisible only when no one is willing to look." That night, she led Delaney upstairs to the attic room on the 3rd floor, a small room with a round window overlooking the street, an old iron bed, and spotless white sheets that still carried the scent of sunlight. She said only that leaving the room empty was a waste, that Delaney could stay there for the time being and consider it payment for watching over the house. Delaney stood in the middle of that room for a long time after the old woman had gone downstairs, one hand resting on the smooth sheet, the first soft thing to touch her life after 7 years of concrete and cardboard. But it wasn't the room that broke her. Near midnight, when she crept down to the kitchen for a glass of water, she found a plate of food carefully covered beneath a mesh food cover on the wooden table beside the window, along with a small note written in the slanted hand of an elderly woman. "Here's your portion. I left it out in case you get hungry in the middle of the night." Delaney sat down before that plate and didn't pick up her spoon for a very long time. In 30 years of life, through foster homes, military service, battlefields, and sidewalks, no one had ever saved a portion of food for her. No one had ever thought that she might grow hungry in the middle of the night. The woman who had taken down 3 gunmen within a handful of breaths without so much as a change in her pulse sat there that night and wept in silence before a plate of food slowly growing cold beneath the warm yellow kitchen light. inside a red brick house she didn't yet know she would have to fight to protect, in a way no one in the entire city could possibly imagine. The days that followed passed to a rhythm Delaney had never known in her life, the rhythm of having a home. She still woke before dawn out of old habit, but instead of opening her eyes beneath a bridge, she saw the first light of morning slipping through the round window of the attic room, and instead of car horns, she heard Miss Dot moving about in the kitchen below, the rush of water from the faucet, and the heavy sound of a cast-iron skillet being set over the flame. She began helping with small tasks, carrying sacks of flour up from the storeroom, repairing the squeaking door hinge, replacing the hallway light bulb. Chores her skilled hands finished in the blink of an eye, leaving Miss Dot to praise her over and over, saying her girl was handier than any repairman in the neighborhood. Those two words, her girl, came from the old woman as lightly as breath, but Delaney had to turn her face away each time she heard them. Then Saturday morning came, and Delaney understood why the entire neighborhood called the Blue Finch the heart of Halstead. Miss Dot had been standing beside the large cast-iron skillet since early morning, pouring ladle after ladle of golden batter, while the scent of pancakes sizzling in butter drifted all the way to the end of the street, like an invitation that needed no words. It was a tradition that had continued for more years than anyone could remember. Every Saturday morning, the restaurant made blueberry pancakes for the neighborhood children. Every child who came received a serving, and no child ever had to pay. Under Miss Dot's rules, they owed only one thing in return. They had to laugh as loudly as they could, and laugh they did. Nearly a dozen children crowded around two wooden tables pushed together, their cheeks bulging with pancakes, their lips smeared with purple blueberry jam, all of them competing to tell stories about school or about someone's dog that had just given birth to 5 puppies, their bright laughter colliding like wind chimes. Delaney stood behind the counter helping Miss Dot pour milk, and before she realized it, she was smiling along with them, an unguarded smile she had believed she'd lost somewhere very far away. Among the children was a little girl of about 7 named Poppy, the daughter of the baker at the end of the street, with shining golden hair braided into 2 plaits, and one newly grown front tooth, still leaving a small gap in her smile. Poppy was the most observant child among them, and for the past several days she had stared at Delaney with wide, admiring eyes whenever she saw her repairing something or carrying a heavy load. That morning, after the other children had finished eating and spilled out into the street to play, Poppy lingered behind, both hands hidden behind her back, her feet fidgeting for a long while before she finally dared to approach Delaney. Then the little girl held out a drawing, her voice filled with equal parts nervousness and pride, and said she had drawn it for Delaney. But Delaney mustn't laugh. On the paper was the figure of a woman drawn in crayon, the crooked, clumsy lines of a child, wearing a moss-green coat whose color spilled beyond its outlines, standing with both arms spread wide before a red house with a blue bird perched on the roof. Above it, written in uneven capital letters with 3 different crayons, were the words, "The Lady Knight of Halstead." Poppy explained in the most serious voice a 7-year-old could summon that her mother had told her knights were people who protected everyone, and since Delaney repaired Miss Dot's doors and carried heavy things for her, that meant Delaney truly was a knight. Delaney lowered herself onto one knee until she was level with the child's eyes, accepted the drawing with both hands, and heard the clear pounding of her own heart. Those hands had once held steady around the most dangerous things a human being could carry. They had endured the harshest trials without a single tremor. Yet now, before a crayon drawing lighter than a leaf, they shook so visibly that she couldn't hide it. She thanked the little girl, her voice growing hoarse, and Poppy broke into a wide grin that showed the gap in her front teeth before racing outside to join her friends. That evening, Delaney taped the drawing to the wall beside the round window in the attic room, carefully smoothing every corner as though she were hanging a medal, because to her, that was exactly what it was. It was the first medal she had ever received, not for bringing someone down, but for helping someone stand. Life continued in that quiet, gentle way until one weekday afternoon, when the restaurant was nearly empty and Miss Dot was in the back kneading dough. The bell above the door chimed, and a tall man stepped inside wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, the kind of clothing that looked completely out of place among the worn wooden tables and chairs of the Blue Finch. The man chose the table in the darkest corner, sat down, and when Delaney approached, he ordered blueberry pancakes and black coffee without sugar, his voice deep and concise, his eyes never leaving the window overlooking the street. He ate slowly and deliberately, finishing every bite without leaving so much as a crumb, drained his coffee, then placed a bill on the table worth 10 times the amount of the check. He rose, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and left without another word, without waiting for change, without looking at anyone. The bell above the door chimed behind him as it swung closed. Delaney stood beside the counter with the cleaning cloth still in her hand, watching through the window as his tall figure disappeared from view. She had recognized him the instant he stepped through the door. She recognized those shoulders, that walk, and the face she had once seen lowered over a rain puddle shimmering beneath red neon light. But she said nothing. She merely cleared away the spotless plate and the empty coffee cup in silence. What Delaney didn't notice was that Miss Dot had been standing in the kitchen doorway behind her for some time, her flour-covered hands motionless against the towel she was holding, her warm brown eyes following the stranger's, retreating back through the glass, with an expression unlike anything Delaney had ever seen there before, deep and distant, as though the old woman were seeing something that no one else in the restaurant, not Delaney, and not even the man who had just walked away, knew anything about. That morning began like every other morning at the Blue Finch, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of the cast-iron skillet on the stove, until the low rumble of engines from the street made the cups on the shelves tremble faintly. Delaney looked up first, an old reflex awakening inside her before thought could catch up. And through the window she saw 3 gleaming black cars pull up one behind another directly in front of the restaurant. The kind of cars the Halstead neighborhood had probably never seen remained parked there for more than a minute. The door of the middle car opened, and a man nearing 60 stepped out, his silver hair arranged strand by strand, his cream-white suit untouched by so much as a speck of dust, and a smile already waiting on his lips before he had even met anyone, the kind of smile perfected through hundreds of ribbon cuttings and charity check presentations before cameras. Behind him came 2 assistants, carrying leather briefcases, followed by a tall, lean man with closely cropped salt and pepper hair, whose cold eyes swept over the entire front of the building from foundation to roof, the gaze of someone who had come to place a value on something that would soon belong to him. The silver-haired man pushed open the door, the bell chimed, and he spread his arms as though returning home, offering a good morning in a voice as sweet as poured honey, and declaring that this must be the renowned Blue Finch he had heard so much about. He introduced himself as Prescott Vaughn, chairman of Meridian Point, and said he had come to bring the owner wonderful news, the greatest news of her life. Miss Dot wiped her hands on her apron, invited him to sit, and poured him coffee properly, just as she would for any other guest, while Vaughn began a speech polished, smooth by repeated use. He described Lakeshore Crown, a resort and commercial complex that would transform the entire Lakeside district, bring jobs to thousands of people, and, by extraordinary good fortune, place her red brick building directly at the heart of the plans. Then he lowered his voice as though preparing to bestow a favor, and said Meridian Point was willing to pay 3 times the market value in cash, handle every document from beginning to end, and include a luxury apartment overlooking the lake within the development itself, owned by her for life, so she could spend her later years in the comfort she deserved. One of the 2 assistants opened a briefcase and placed a thick stack of documents on the table, with a gold-plated pen arranged neatly on top. The restaurant fell silent. Miss Dot looked at the documents, then at Prescott Vaughn, and slowly pushed his coffee cup toward him, as though reminding him to drink before it grew cold. In the calm voice of someone who had lived long enough to stop fearing beautiful suits, she thanked him for coming all the way there, but suggested that whoever had drawn his map should draw it again, because they had placed their heart in the wrong location. Vaughn's smile stiffened for half a second, then softened at once. He leaned forward and told her to think about it, that the figure was negotiable, and that everything in this world had a price. That was when Miss Dot rose. She didn't raise her voice or change her expression. She merely placed one wrinkled hand on the wooden tabletop worn smooth by years of cleaning, and spoke each word with perfect clarity. My husband built every step of this staircase with his own 2 hands. As long as I'm still breathing, this place has no price. Delaney stood behind the counter without saying a word, but her ash-gray eyes had settled on the salt and pepper-haired man who had remained beside the door the entire time, the only member of the group who hadn't looked at Miss Dot even once, but had studied the locks, the entrances, the exits, and the wooden beams across the ceiling. Their eyes met for a single moment, and each recognized something in the other that no one else in the room could see, the unmistakable presence of a professional. Prescott Vaughn gathered up the documents, his smile still fixed in place, and said he admired determined women, that he would return on a day with better weather. Then the entire group departed beneath the chime of the doorbell. But inside the dark windowed black car as it rolled away from Halstead, the smile fell from his face like an expired mask. Prescott Vaughn leaned back against the leather seat, his jaw clenched tight, and his true face emerged, the face of a man drowning inside his own empire. The entire city saw Meridian Point as a golden tower, but only he knew that the tower was hollow all the way down to its foundations. Investors' money had vanished into stalled projects, and hanging over everything was an enormous loan from an anonymous creditor hidden in the shadows. A debt large enough to drag him and everything bearing the Vaughn name beneath the surface, if Lakeshore Crown didn't break ground before summer. The Halstead district was his final card, and a 70-year-old woman with a pancake restaurant stood between him and survival. Vaughn looked toward the salt and pepper-haired man seated across from him, the man who had remained silent from the beginning, and spoke only 2 words in a voice as dry as gravel. "Clear it." Gage Hollis gave a slight nod and asked no questions, because in more than 20 years of doing this nameless kind of work, he had never needed anyone to explain what those 2 words meant. Back at the Blue Finch that evening, after the customers had gone and the door had been bolted, Miss Dot asked Delaney to sit with her at the table beside the window. She went upstairs for a while, then returned holding a small object wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief. When she unfolded the cloth, an old folding knife lay inside, its walnut handle polished to a deep brown shine by years of use, with 2 initials carved into it in lines that were clumsy but painstakingly careful. She said it had belonged to her husband, that he had carved the handle when they were newly married, carried it everywhere, and used it to peel apples for her for 40 years. She placed the knife in Delaney's palm, closed the younger woman's fingers around the wooden handle still warm from the handkerchief, and said she was old now, and keeping it only meant leaving it in a drawer. Delaney should have it, to peel apples, and to remember that she had a home to come back to. Delaney looked down at the knife resting in her hand, feeling the grain of the walnut against her palm like a heartbeat, and she nodded without finding the words to speak, because she didn't yet know that before much longer, this gift meant for peeling apples would follow her into a night the entire Halstead district would never forget. That night, the Halstead district fell asleep earlier than usual. A cold wind blowing in from the lake drove the shops to close ahead of time, and by midnight, the entire row of streets lay deserted, without a single person in sight. Every light in every house had gone dark, leaving only the street lamp at the mouth of the alley to cast its pale yellow glow across a road no one traveled. The Blue Finch had been bolted shut for hours. Miss Dot slept soundly in her small room on the 2nd floor after a long day at the stove, while Delaney lay in the attic, sleeping as she had throughout the past 7 years. The way a person slept after living in places where surrendering fully to sleep could cost a life. Half of her was always awake, so when the faint scrape of metal prying at the back door rose from the ground floor, soft enough to disappear beneath the wind, her ash-gray eyes opened in the darkness. She remained still for several breaths, counting footsteps. 2 men, one heavy, one light. They moved around the storeroom toward the corner of the kitchen, where the gas line ran. Delaney left the bed without making a sound, glided down the stairs with steps trained not to wake even a rotting floorboard, and stopped behind the kitchen doorway. In the dim light spilling in from the street lamp, 2 dark figures crouched beside the pipe. The larger man held a flashlight with half its beam covered by his palm, while the thinner one worked a tool against the pipe fitting. Their whispered exchange reached her clearly, every word of it. All they had to do was loosen the connection enough for the gas to leak slowly. Near dawn, when the old woman lit the stove, everything would look like an accident caused by a crumbling old building. No one would ask questions. Something cold awakened inside Delaney's chest, something she had kept buried for 7 years, because these men hadn't come to steal. They had come to arrange the death of the elderly woman who had given her the first home she had ever known. The kettle Miss Dot had left on the stove the night before still held a trace of warmth, and everything was over before that warmth had time to fade. Delaney stepped into the darkness between the 2 kitchen shelves, and the thin man holding the tool never even understood whose hand had seized his wrist. She turned it in one clean motion, sending the tool falling, then caught it before it struck the floor and made a sound. One precise blow landed at exactly the right point, and his legs gave way beneath him as he collapsed like a sack of flour. The larger man spun around and swung the flashlight, but its beam swept across nothing except an empty stretch of kitchen, because the woman was already behind him. She pulled the cast-iron skillet from its hook and used it to block his frantic punch. Metal answered with a low, muffled clang, followed by a sweep of her leg that sent his heavy body sprawling across the tile floor. The large man scrambled to rise, and in the circle of streetlight shining through the window, he finally saw his opponent clearly. A slender woman stood upright in the center of the kitchen, the cast-iron skillet hanging loosely at her side, her face calm and untouched by fear. That calm frightened him more deeply than any blow could have. The large man, whom his companion had called Buck in their whispers moments earlier, decided in an instant that the money he had been promised wasn't worth remaining there for even one more second. He charged through the back door, raced across the yard, climbed over the fence, and ran as though the darkness itself were pursuing him. Delaney didn't follow. She still had one man on the floor to watch. The thin man named Odell lay groaning and clutching his shoulder, and with nothing more than a clothesline taken from a hook on the wall, she bound his hands behind his back with knots. No workman in the city would have known how to untie. Miss Dot woke with a start at the noise and turned on the stairway light with trembling hands. The police were called soon afterward, and 2 patrol officers took Odell away after filing a report for breaking and entering, while Delaney showed them every mark on the gas fitting he had begun to loosen. But the night wasn't over. Not long after the patrol car disappeared at the end of the street, a familiar black vehicle came to a sharp stop in front of the restaurant, and Ronan Ashford stepped inside looking unlike anything Delaney had ever seen before. His breathing hadn't fully settled, his hair was disordered by the wind, and the left sleeve of his shirt had been torn open in a long line, dark red blood seeping through it. His people had been quietly watching the neighborhood ever since the afternoon he visited the restaurant, and news of the intrusion had reached him almost immediately. While speeding toward Halstead, he had intercepted the large man fleeing near the end of the street. A brief struggle followed before the man managed to break free and vanish into the darkness, leaving a gash across Ronan's arm from a jagged piece of metal on the fence. Miss Dot hurried forward in alarm and tried to bandage him, but Delaney silently took down the old woman's tin sewing box from the top of the cabinet, pulled a chair beside the table, and told him to sit in a voice that allowed no refusal. Beneath the warm yellow kitchen light, she cleaned the cut and threaded a needle with movements so practiced that Ronan raised one eyebrow. Then she stitched the wound with neat, even, certain movements, her hands perfectly steady, the hands of someone who had done this many times in places where there were no hospitals. The kitchen remained silent for a long while, filled only by the sound of thread passing through flesh and the ticking of the old clock on the wall, until Ronan spoke in a deep, low voice and asked the question he had carried with him since that rainy night. She hadn't known who he was in that alley. She owed him nothing. 3 guns pointed at a stranger had nothing to do with her sleep, so why had she gotten up? Delaney didn't raise her head. Her hands continued moving steadily through each stitch, and after a silence so long that he thought she wouldn't answer, her voice rose softly through the kitchen. Because you were kneeling on the concrete, but your back was still straight. I once knew someone like that. She tied the final knot, neatly cut away the excess thread, and offered no further explanation. Ronan looked at the woman lowering her head as she gathered the needle and thread before him, while on the kitchen wall washed in yellow light behind them, their 2 shadows leaned toward each other and quietly merged into one, as though those shadows already knew something the 2 people who cast them still didn't dare give a name. If the night before had brought the darkness of men slipping in through the back door, the following morning brought a different kind of darkness, one that entered through the front door, wore a uniform, and carried an official seal. Miss Dot and Delaney had barely finished preparing the restaurant for customers when several police cars pulled up outside, and the first man to step out was broad-shouldered and thick-set, dressed in an immaculate police uniform, a gleaming captain's badge pinned to his chest, with the fleshy face of someone who had spent too many years behind a desk. Captain Walton Byrne of the district police station, the man who should have come that morning to update them on the case against Odell, who had been caught in the act the night before, instead began with news that left the restaurant deathly still. Odell had been released early that morning for lack of evidence. The report stated that he was merely a drunk who had wandered into the backyard by mistake. The partially loosened gas pipe fitting wasn't enough to charge anyone, because perhaps it had already been loose in an old, crumbling building like this one. Delaney stood behind the counter, her hands slowly tightening at her sides. She had seen the tool in his hand with her own eyes. She had heard them discussing how they would stage the scene with her own ears. Yet after only one night, the man who had come to murder an elderly woman had walked calmly out of the police station through the front door. But that was only the first half of the performance. Byrne removed a stack of papers bearing red official seals from his leather case, and his voice took on a false air of solemn authority, as he announced that the station had received an anonymous complaint regarding food sanitation and safety at the Bluefinch. Under regulations, he said, an inspection team was required to begin its work immediately. With a wave of his hand, he sent several officers straight into the kitchen and storeroom, as though they had memorized the layout of the building beforehand. The inspection moved with suspicious speed. Before anyone had finished a single cup of coffee, one of the officers called out from the cold storage room, and what they carried out were several packages of frozen meat without labels, buried deep at the bottom of the freezer, the kind of unregulated goods that were prohibited by law and that Miss Dot had never purchased in her life. For 40 years, she had bought only from familiar local suppliers, keeping every invoice carefully filed in a drawer. Miss Dot froze, then opened her ledger of receipts with trembling hands to prove it. But Byrne didn't even glance at a single line. He read aloud an order sealing the restaurant pending investigation, and 2 strips of yellow police tape were stretched across the entrance of the Bluefinch, before the stunned eyes of several neighbors who had gathered outside. The victim of the previous night's break-in had become the subject of an investigation before the morning was over, while the culprit walked freely through the streets. When Miss Dot was asked to come to the station to give a statement, the man who helped her toward the car was a young detective, with a gentle face and eyes that couldn't conceal the conflict inside him. His badge bore the name Micah Doyle. He supported the old woman carefully by the elbow, as though she were his own grandmother, and quietly reassured her that she had nothing to fear, that it was only a routine statement, and that as long as he was there, no one would be allowed to mistreat her. As he passed Delaney, who stood blocking the front step with fire in her eyes, the young detective paused for half a beat, pretended to bend down and straighten his trouser leg, and let a sentence escape through his teeth so softly that only one person could hear it. Not everyone wearing a uniform is blind. Then he walked away as though he had said nothing at all. Delaney stood motionless before the sealed restaurant, the 2 strips of yellow tape snapping in the wind like an insult, and she understood that this was no longer the work of a few petty criminals. This was a machine that knew how to use both official seals and crowbars, and it was grinding toward the red brick building from every direction. News reached the harbor before noon. Ronan Ashford listened to the report without striking the table or raising his voice. He merely stood beside the window for a long time, looking out over the gray lake, turning the mechanical watch around his wrist, then picked up the telephone and made a single call, brief and no more than 10 sentences long. The following morning, the bank simultaneously froze the release of funds for Meridian Point's 3 largest projects, and the city's financial world erupted like a disturbed beehive, though no one understood what had just happened. In his office on the highest floor of Meridian Tower, Prescott Vaughn read the notices from the banks over and over, and for the first time in years, someone saw the hand bearing his gold ring tremble as he lowered the papers onto the glass desk. In that moment, Vaughn finally assembled the picture he had never wanted to see. The shadowy connections surrounding the Halstead district, the stubborn pancake restaurant, and now the invisible hand that had shut off his flow of money overnight all pointed to a name he had never dared imagine, the name behind the enormous secret loan hanging over his neck like a blade, Ronan Ashford, the man to whom he owed more than he could ever repay, and the man whose people, dear God, whose people had touched something that belonged to him. Vaughn collapsed into his chair and loosened his tie, understanding that he had no road left behind him. If the debt came due, he was finished. If he stopped the project, he was finished. The only path remaining was forward, faster, more ruthless, regardless of whether the person standing in his way was an elderly woman or the crime lord who ruled the entire harbor. And so, with Prescott Vaughn's desperate machine accelerating on one side and Ronan Ashford's cold power tightening its grip on the other, 2 enormous gears of the city began grinding against each other. Directly between their crushing teeth, small and weathered, stood a red brick building with a faded blue bird painted on its sign, a place where an elderly woman still believed kindness was worth preserving above everything else in this world, and where another woman had sworn to herself that this time she wouldn't allow another home to be taken from her. The restaurant had been sealed, but the yellow tape blocked only the door through which customers entered. It couldn't keep out those who already lived inside. During the days when Miss Dot had to travel back and forth between the house and the police station to complete her interviews, Delaney remained behind to guard the red brick building like a soldier who needed no one to assign her the duty. She inspected every lock, every hinge, every window, added another bolt to the back door where the 2 men had forced their way in, and while shifting several heavy storage shelves to make that entrance more difficult to reach, she noticed something unusual that 7 years of living by instinct had taught her never to ignore. The sound of her own footsteps across the storeroom floor wasn't even. One section answered with a hollow thud unlike the rest. Delaney moved the wooden platform beneath the supplies, brushed aside layers of dust and sawdust that had gathered there for untold years, and uncovered an old wooden trapdoor with a rusted iron ring, the kind of storage cellar common beneath century-old houses in that neighborhood, but long forgotten by everyone. She lit the oil lamp hanging in the storeroom, descended one creaking wooden step at a time into the earth, and what awaited her below wasn't wine or old furniture as she had expected, but wooden crates arranged neatly along the stone wall and carefully covered with tarps. Inside them were stacks of yellowed paper files, tightly bound with string and labeled in a neat man's handwriting, a hand she recognized immediately because it looked exactly like the carved letters on the walnut handle of the knife resting in her coat pocket. Miss Dot's late husband, old Mr. Mercer, whom everyone in the neighborhood remembered as a gentle carpenter, had apparently spent the final years of his life quietly doing something no one knew about. He had gathered and preserved evidence for families from the old harbor district, names Delaney had never heard before, though their fates emerged from the pages with a horrifying sameness. An auto repair shop burned to the ground during the night, and the official report blamed an electrical fault even though the owner insisted the entire system had just been replaced. A grocery store was found by inspectors to contain prohibited goods that the owner swore he had never purchased. One family received threatening letters for months before finally surrendering and selling their home for almost nothing. And every one of those properties, Delaney felt a chill as she traced the maps Mr. Mercer had drawn by hand, had eventually fallen into the possession of companies whose trails all converged upon a corporation that had preceded Meridian Point. More painful than anything were the formal complaints. Mr. Mercer had helped those families write them and had properly submitted them to the district police station, saving every receipt. But beside each receipt was a trembling note in his fading ink. Complaint lost. No one called back. File missing. And in the corner of those yellowed receipts, repeated year after year, was the same signature of the officer who had accepted them. A hurried scrawl that still clearly spelled the name Walton Byrne, likely only a young officer then, the same man who had walked proudly into the restaurant the previous morning with a captain's badge on his chest. Delaney sat motionless in the cellar, surrounded by hundreds of lives crushed beneath a machine and quietly preserved by an elderly carpenter, as though he were tending graves without headstones. When she lifted the final stack of documents from the bottom of the crate in the deepest corner, the oil lamp illuminated a file wrapped separately in oilcloth and tied more securely than all the others, as though Mr. Mercer had known it was the most dangerous thing there. On its brown, aging label, only 2 words had been written with careful precision. Patrick Ashford. During those same days, on the other side of the city, another excavation was taking place in silence. Ronan Ashford had understood that a person whose name had been erased couldn't be found through ordinary channels, so he turned to the black market whose entrance only men like him knew how to locate, a place where secrets buried by powerful institutions were bought and sold at ruinous prices, and he paid without blinking. What returned after several days of waiting was only a thin envelope, but the pages inside left a man who seemed beyond the reach of surprise, sitting completely still at his desk for a very long time. The woman in the moss-green coat had once possessed a name in the military, along with a call sign spoken with wary respect among the most elite units. Silent Shadow. She had been a special reconnaissance operative with a record of hostage rescues described in language so dry and official that it still couldn't conceal how extraordinary she had been. A woman who had never failed a mission until the last one. A mission that, according to the few surviving lines, had ended in a tragedy placed entirely upon her shoulders. Her closest comrade hadn't returned. Every piece of evidence pointed toward her with a perfection suspicious in itself. There had been no public court-martial, no recorded defense, only an order of discharge and a directive erasing her entire identity, carried out immediately and cleanly, as though someone were removing a line written by mistake. For 7 years, the woman who had returned so many hostages to their families had lived without documents, without a past, without the right to prove her innocence, sleeping behind piles of cardboard in an alley of the city she had once bled to serve. Ronan turned to the final page, where a faded copy of the original erasure order remained, and his gaze rested for a long time on the approving signature at the bottom, a name accompanied by a military rank he had never heard before, but committed to memory in that very instant. Colonel Harlan Voss. He didn't yet know that this name would return, just as Delaney, standing in the cellar beneath the house, didn't know that the oilcloth-wrapped file in her hands bore the family name of the man whose wound she had just stitched. Two people at opposite ends of the city had each touched one half of the same truth, and those two halves were slowly moving toward each other like underground currents, waiting only for the day they would meet and wash away everything that had been built upon lies. Delaney didn't open the oilcloth-wrapped file alone, because the instant she read the name on the label, she understood who had the first right to see what was inside. The following evening, when the familiar black car arrived in response to her message, Delaney led Ronan into the cellar beneath the house, the oil lamp casting their two shadows long across the century-old stone wall, and placed into his hands the file an elderly carpenter had wrapped as carefully as though it were a bomb. She spoke only one quiet sentence. "You should be the one to open it." Ronan looked at the two words Patrick Ashford on the yellowed label, and the fingers that had signed contracts worth trillions paused at the knot in the string. Inside were pages that carried him back more than 20 years to the harbor, back to the father he had spent half his life trying to forget. In those days, Patrick Ashford had been nothing more than a ship repairman with gifted hands and a back that refused to bend for anyone, a man beloved throughout the harbor because he sometimes repaired poor fishermen's boats for no payment beyond a catch of fish. Then the fires began. One workshop after another, one warehouse after another along the old harbor district, turned to ash on windy nights. Every official report reached the same conclusion: electrical failure, misfortune, fate, and the half-burned properties quietly changed hands. Patrick was the only man who stood up and said aloud what everyone else only dared to think. He went from house to house, knocked on every door, and stood in the middle of the fish market declaring that human hands were behind those fires, that someone was swallowing the small families of the harbor one by one. He wrote complaints, rallied neighbors, and even stepped in front of officials' cars to force documents into their hands. And how had the city answered him? The pages in the file gave the answer. People began calling him the mad ship repairman. Those who had once nodded while listening to him gradually avoided him for fear of becoming involved. Every complaint he submitted disappeared into silence. Then, one winter morning, his body was found in the water beneath the pier. The report contained only a few lines. He had slipped during the night. Alcohol had been found in his blood. He was responsible for his own death. An entire human life was closed with the cold language of paperwork. But old Mr. Mercer hadn't believed it, and he had done what the entire city had refused to do. He had preserved everything. Inside the file was a copy of the scene examination report, certified by a private inspection company that had recently won every inspection contract around the harbor. On the line identifying the employee who had conducted the examination was the name Gage Hollis, only 22 years old at the time, his immature signature resting beneath the conclusion that had cleared the path for everything that followed. Mr. Mercer had also written a note in the margin in fading ink. 2 fishermen had said they saw Patrick leave the restaurant sober that night. He hadn't been drinking because he was scheduled to deliver a boat the following morning. But who would bother recording the word of fisherman in an official report? Ronan reached that passage and couldn't continue. He closed the file with a strange and deliberate care, thanked Delaney in a voice so steady it was frightening, climbed out of the cellar, got into his car, and drove alone into the night, without bodyguards or an escort. The car didn't take him back to the penthouse overlooking the lake. It carried him to an old garage beneath an overpass where he stored cars he never used. There, between 4 concrete walls with no one present before whom he had to preserve his dignity, the most powerful man in Chicago turned off the engine and remained inside the car for a very long time. Then he opened the door and stepped out. He managed only a few steps before all strength seemed to leave his knees, and he collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, his back against the side of the car, the file still clutched tightly to his chest. For more than 20 years, the 10-year-old boy he had once been had grown up ashamed of his father, ashamed whenever neighborhood children mocked the words Patrick had shouted in the fish market, so ashamed that he abandoned the Ashford name during his earliest years of struggle and reclaimed it only after he had become powerful enough that no one dared laugh at it anymore. He had built an entire empire upon the foundation of that shame, telling himself he would never be as foolish as his father, would never believe that justice could stand unarmed, and would never allow anyone to trample him. Yet the man the whole city had called insane had been the only one who saw the truth. the only one who dared remain standing while the entire harbor bowed its head. A father who had died alone with the label of a drunk fastened to his life, while somewhere else in that same city, his son was learning to forget him and feeling ashamed of him. The first sob broke from Ronan Ashford's chest with the dry sound of wood splitting. Then his shoulders began to shake, and the first tears he had shed in more than 20 years fell onto the dusty concrete floor. They weren't the tears of a defeated man. They were the most belated tears in the world. The tears of a son apologizing to someone who could no longer hear him. He didn't hear the footsteps, but he felt the warmth when Delaney sat down on the concrete beside him, leaving exactly enough distance between them. She didn't touch him. She didn't place a hand on his shoulder. She didn't offer a single word of comfort, because she understood better than anyone that some things shattered too deeply for words to hold together. All a person could do was sit beside the wreckage, silently stand watch over it, and wait for it to rise on its own. They remained there for a long time in the cold garage, two people crushed by the same city in different ways, one stripped of her name, the other stripped of his father, until Ronan finally lifted his head and wiped his face with the back of his hand like a child. When he spoke, his voice had returned to cold steel. He thanked her, then said that now he had several old debts to repay, debts that had gone uncollected for more than 20 years. The next several days passed in a silence stretched as tight as a drawn wire, and then one evening, Miss Dot decided that even if the restaurant had been sealed, her kitchen was still her kitchen, and no official order could forbid an old woman from cooking dinner for her 2 children. That was what she called Delaney and Ronan, her 2 children, even though one was a former special operative, and the other was a man before whom the entire city lowered its head. Because the restaurant's electricity had been cut under the sealing order, she lit candles, white candles placed in glass cups along the wooden table beside the window, and beneath their warm glow, the old restaurant became strangely beautiful, like an old photograph illuminated from within. Miss Dot prepared the poor family's stew, she insisted, tasted best when eaten with an old spoon. Delaney helped set the table, and Ronan Ashford, a man with an entire team of private chefs at his command, sat peeling onions because an elderly woman in an apron had told him to, and he performed the task with such grave concentration that Delaney had to turn away to hide a smile. They ate to the quiet crackle of candle flames and the wind moving through the street outside. No one mentioned the seal, Meridian, or the forces tightening around the house, because all 3 of them understood without saying it that this dinner was a borrowed moment of peace, and no one wasted a borrowed moment of peace speaking about enemies. When Miss Dot brought out dessert, a small plate of blueberry pancakes dusted with powdered sugar, Ronan set down his spoon, studied the pancakes for a long while in the candlelight, and told them something he had never told another soul. He said that during the winter when he was 10 years old, only a few days after his father's funeral, he wandered through the Halstead district on a bitterly cold afternoon and stopped outside a brightly lit window. Inside, people were eating, laughing, and talking, and the warmth seemed to spill all the way onto the sidewalk, while he stood outside and watched, because the little boy had nothing in his pockets, and no one left behind him. He said he had been about to keep walking when the restaurant door opened, and a woman in a blue apron stepped into the cold carrying a steaming plate of blueberry pancakes. She placed it in the boy's hands and said, with a carefully irritated voice, that he would be doing her a favor by eating them because she had measured the batter wrong that day, made one serving too many, and it would be sinful to throw it away. Ronan paused, slowly turning the mechanical watch around his wrist, then continued in a lower voice, saying that only much later had he understood that no one had measured the batter wrong. The woman had simply lied so an orphaned boy could eat without lowering his head, so he could believe he was helping someone else instead of receiving charity. And throughout that entire winter, the restaurant somehow measured the batter wrong exactly once every week, always on the day he passed by. He looked up, his eyes resting on the plate before him, and spoke the sentence Delaney knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Now I could buy this entire city, but the only thing I truly long for is to have someone lie to me kindly like that one more time. The restaurant fell silent. A candle flame trembled softly. Delaney lowered her eyes to her hands resting on the table, while Miss Dot said nothing at all. She merely smiled, a gentle smile of bottomless depth beneath the candlelight, then lifted the teapot and filled Ronan's cup nearly to the rim, moving with the calm patience of someone who had waited a very long time to hear that story. Neither of the younger people noticed that her hand didn't tremble, that she showed no surprise, as though she had known every word before he spoke it. Only the wind outside changed direction. At that exact moment, the phone in Ronan's coat pocket began to vibrate. He answered and said nothing throughout the call, but his eyes changed, from warm to cold, and from cold to steel. When he placed the phone on the table, both Delaney and Miss Dot understood that the borrowed moment had come due. His people at the harbor had just reported that earlier that afternoon, Gage Hollis had met a group of unfamiliar men in a parking lot outside the city. Men who moved like soldiers and carried long equipment cases. They came from a private security company, whose name made Ronan pause for half a heartbeat, a company owned by Harlan Voss. Every sign pointed in the same direction, toward the same address, toward this red brick house. Tonight, Ronan rose and fastened his jacket. Delaney was already on her feet before he had fully stood. Their eyes met across the candlelight, and no further words were needed. Miss Dot looked at her two children, released the faintest sigh, then began clearing the dishes, slowly and neatly, like a woman who had survived enough storms to know that before the next one arrived, the wisest thing to do was wash the plates from a good and decent meal. The storm arrived even faster than expected, but the person waiting to meet it was ready before it had fully taken shape. Immediately after the call, Ronan raced into the night to gather his men from the harbor, because he understood that the unfamiliar team couldn't be taken lightly. While back at the red brick house, Delaney began doing the one thing she knew better than anything else in the world. Her first concern was Miss Dot. She guided the old woman down into the cellar beneath the storeroom, where the stone walls were thick. Air entered through an old ventilation shaft, and a passage opened into the backyard, an exit Delaney had discovered during her earlier inspection. She laid out blankets, set down a flashlight and drinking water, then instructed Miss Dot in a voice that was gentle but allowed no argument that no matter what sounds she heard above, she mustn't open the cellar door until she heard Delaney knock slowly, exactly 3 times. Miss Dot didn't object, but she insisted on returning to her room for one thing: the worn leather-bound recipe book she clutched against her chest like a child. She said her whole life was inside it, that a house could be rebuilt, but this couldn't, and Delaney didn't argue with her about that. She simply didn't know that this small decision by an elderly woman would one day become the thing that saved her heart. The cellar door closed, and Delaney stood alone in the darkened restaurant, drew one long breath, and then Silent Shadow went to work. She had no weapon, but she had never needed one, because the first lesson her old unit had taught her was that every room was filled with weapons if a person knew how to look. She removed the cluster of little bells from the front door, divided them into smaller groups, and strung them on sewing thread across the dark passageways at ankle height, not to stop anyone, but to become her ears. Each cluster had a different tone, so the instant she heard one ring, she would know which corridor the intruder had entered. She cut down the clothesline from the yard, doubled and braided it, then stretched it across the bend in the staircase at shin level, creating trip lines no ordinary eye could see in the darkness. She scattered a layer of flour as thin as mist across every threshold, the oldest alarm in the world. Anyone who crossed it would leave a trail and carry that trail with them. She shut off the main electrical breaker completely, surrendering the whole house to darkness, because darkness was her home ground. The cast iron skillet, broom handles, glass bottles, kettle, and every harmless object from a quiet little restaurant were placed where only she understood their purpose. When everything was ready, Delaney stepped backward into the darkness between 2 kitchen cabinets, slowed her breathing, and waited. Outside, the neighborhood had long since fallen asleep. Every home was dark and locked, the street completely empty, with only the wind and the street lamp at the end of the alley remaining. It was within that absolute stillness that the shadows began to appear, spreading out from 2 vans parked some distance away, moving along the darkest edges of the walls in a disciplined formation. 6 men divided into 3 teams, one approaching the back door, one the side window, and one holding position at the front. All of them wore night vision goggles, and moved like men who had carried out the same kind of work together in many places across the world. The first man entered through the back door. He picked the lock with a softness, almost like a lullaby, slipped into the storeroom, and on his 3rd step touched the invisible thread. A cluster of bells gave a faint chime from the far corner. He spun toward the sound by instinct, and that was exactly what Delaney wanted, because in the instant he turned away, the darkness behind him moved. One hand locked around his elbow. Precise pressure struck the side of his neck, and he went limp. She lowered him gently to the floor without a sound, removed his night vision goggles, and bound him tightly. The second man entered through the side window. He was more cautious, testing each step. But the flower along the threshold had recorded the print of his boot, and as he moved through the dark corridor, the doubled clothesline at the bend in the staircase swept across his shins and pitched him forward. Before he could reach the floor, a perfectly placed blow was already waiting. Another man fell silent, was dragged into a shadowed corner, tied securely, and placed beside his companion. In the headsets of the remaining men, the two entry teams went silent one after another, and that silence made them hesitate. Their professional discipline began to fracture into urgent whispers, calling for answers that never came. 2 more men were ordered to enter simultaneously from both directions and divide her attention. But dividing the attention of a shadow was like trying to punch through fog. One triggered the bell trap in the front corridor and was disabled where he stood. The other managed to retreat into the middle of the storeroom before a thread pulled the kettle from its tilted position atop a shelf, sending metal crashing loudly to the east. He swung his weapon toward the noise, and from the west, the darkness descended upon him, swift, exact, without a single unnecessary drop of blood, leaving only another body laid neatly on the floor. 4 men had fallen silent in less time than it took to finish a cup of tea. Across the street, hidden beneath the trees with the last 2 men, Gage Hollis lowered his binoculars, his cold expression unchanged. He had recognized the pattern. No gunshots meant no panic. The teams had lost contact in the exact order of their entry routes, which meant there was only one person inside, and that person controlled the darkness as though moving pieces across a board of her own design. Gage Hollis had survived more than 20 years in this profession precisely because he knew when not to continue playing on an opponent's board. Slowly, he raised his radio and ordered the remaining 2 men back to the vans. He told them to open the rear compartment and take out the plastic containers filled with shimmering liquid, then spoke in the same flat voice one might use to read a price list. If we can't get inside, burn it. But another storm was racing toward Halstead that night. Headlights swept in bright flashes across the end of the street as a black car leading 3 others braked hard beside the 2 vans. And the first man to step out was Ronan Ashford, the shoulders of his coat still speckled with the light rain that had begun falling along the way, followed by Wade Corrigan and the men from the harbor. The 2 men carrying Gage's plastic containers stopped in the middle of the street. One of them slowly took a step backward, then another, because in the underworld where they earned their living, some faces were passed from mouth to mouth more carefully than wanted posters, and the face of the man standing beneath the street lamp was at the very top of that list. No one needed to fire a gun. No one needed to shout an order. The mercenary who had worked across 3 continents set the container gently on the pavement, as though laying down an egg, raised both hands to shoulder height, and told his companion in a hoarse voice that every contract had an exclusion clause, and the name Ashford was the exclusion clause in every contract. No one could pay enough money to make facing that man worthwhile. Then he backed completely into the darkness and disappeared, and the man beside him dropped his load and fled after him. But Gage Hollis wasn't a mercenary. He was a man who had wagered his entire life on this gamble, and while every eye turned toward Ronan, his hand had already completed its work. A small flame fell onto the trail of liquid one of his men had managed to pour along the rear wall, and the fire raced forward like a blazing serpent, climbed the century-old wooden doorframe, caught the storeroom, and within only a few breaths, the entire back of the red brick house erupted into a vast red glow that illuminated the whole street. The blue finch was burning. Delaney rushed down into the storeroom before the first shout rose outside. Smoke was already rolling thickly around the cellar door. She knocked 3 times slowly, then couldn't bear to wait and tore the wooden hatch open. Beneath the trembling beam of the flashlight, Miss Dot was coughing violently, one arm still wrapped tightly around the recipe book pressed to her chest. The old cellar vent had somehow become a tunnel carrying smoke directly inside. Delaney lifted her over one shoulder, with the same movement she had once used to carry comrades away from battlefields, followed the passage leading into the backyard, kicked through the rotting wooden door, and broke through the smoke into the open yard, where the cold night air struck their lungs like water. But Miss Dot had breathed in smoke for too long. The moment they reached safety, her coughing weakened, her grip on the recipe book loosened, and her small body collapsed into Delaney's arms as softly as a leaf. Delaney lowered her to the ground, checked her breathing, and ordered Ronan's men to call an ambulance in a voice of command that made even the hardest men obey without hesitation. While kneeling there in the yard with both hands supporting the old woman's head, Delaney looked toward the end of the alley for Ronan, and that was when she saw it. The fire was burning brightly enough to illuminate every smallest detail on the street. And there, beside Ronan, Wade Corrigan stood listening to his phone, one foot resting lightly on the curb. His trouser leg had risen just enough to reveal black leather shoes, whose laces were tied in a style unlike anyone else's, a tight double loop with the ends tucked inward in the manner of an old generation of paratroopers, the kind of insignificant detail a reconnaissance operative's mind had been trained to capture, without needing to understand it immediately. And that mind, here and now, amid smoke and fire, reached into its store of memories and pulled out an image from the rainy night in the alley. One of the three masked men had lain unconscious on the concrete, and the flashing red neon had illuminated his shoes, a tight double loop, the ends tucked inward, a match, not merely similar, but identical down to every turn of the laces. The blood in Delaney's body turned cold. The scattered pieces from the past several days arranged themselves inside her mind with such speed that she nearly staggered. The man who knew Ronan's schedule, the man who could send his bodyguards away with a single telephone call, the only person who knew that a message concerning his father's file would draw the crime lord to Halstead alone, the man assigned to investigate the very ambush he had arranged, and tonight, the only outsider who had known the timing of the house's defenses in advance. Every piece pointed to one person, the man who had stood behind Ronan Ashford for 20 years. Delaney sprang to her feet. Her cry of Ronan's name tore through the roar of the flames, and her arm pointed directly toward Corrigan. For a fraction of a breath, the right-hand man's eyes met her ash-gray gaze, and that was enough. He understood immediately that she had read him. There wasn't a second of denial or another attempt at pretending. Corrigan dropped the phone onto the ground, stepped backward twice into the darkness between two rows of buildings, and vanished with the clean speed of a man who had practiced his escape route for this exact moment long ago. Ronan charged after him to the mouth of the narrow passage, but only empty darkness remained. His men scattered in every direction at his command, while he stood there with the flames devouring the red brick house on one side, and the darkness that had just swallowed the man he trusted more than anyone in the world on the other. Across his face, the fire illuminated something colder than the night itself, devastation compressed into steel. The ambulance departed carrying Miss Dot, with Delaney seated beside the stretcher. The fire engines arrived in time to prevent the flames from spreading to the neighboring houses, but they couldn't save the Blue Finch. When the first gray light of dawn appeared, and the final streams of water had been shut off, Ronan Ashford walked alone through the lingering smoke, stepping into soaked ashes that reached his ankles. He passed the blackened frames of the mismatched wooden tables, stopped where the darkest corner table had once stood, bent down, and lifted a small smoke-stained object from the gray ashes. It was his father's mechanical watch, the one he had removed and placed on the table when he rolled up his sleeves to help fight the fire during the night. The glass was cracked diagonally, and the leather strap was scorched. He wiped away the soot with his thumb, pressed it to his ear in the silence of the morning, and amid the soft fall of ashes all around him, he heard it, steady, enduring, refusing to stop. Tick, tick, tick. The ship repairman's watch was still running. Late at night, the hospital held only the steady hum of machines and the soft sound of nurses' shoes gliding along the corridor. And in the intensive care room at the far end of the hall, Miss Dot lay among tubes and blinking monitors, so small that the hospital bed seemed twice its size, her chest rising and falling weakly with the rhythm of the ventilator. The doctor said her lungs had been damaged by the smoke, that her age made the situation more dangerous, and that the coming days would decide everything, but no one dared promise what the outcome would be. Delaney had sat beside the bed from the moment Miss Dot was admitted, and hadn't taken a single step away. The hands that had once dismantled the most dangerous things in the world could do nothing now, except hold the wrinkled hand resting motionless on the white blanket. The hand that had placed a bowl of hot soup on a cold stone step, had folded Delaney's fingers around the walnut handle of a knife, and had filled a teacup beneath candlelight. On the small table beside the bed lay everything that remained of the Blue Finch, a smoke-stained, leather-bound recipe book the old woman had clutched until she lost consciousness, and the nurses had been forced to gently loosen her fingers one by one before they could take it from her. Near dawn, when exhaustion began dragging Delaney's eyelids down, she reached for the book, intending to wipe away some of the soot for Miss Dot, and as the pages carrying the smell of smoke slipped through her fingers, pages filled with recipes written in that familiar slanting hand: honey butter bread, chicken soup for cold days, blueberry pancakes with twice the batter on Saturday mornings. An envelope slid from the middle of the book and fell into her lap. The paper had yellowed with age and wasn't sealed. On the front were only a few words written in ink that had dried long ago. For my daughter. Read this when you feel brave enough. Delaney sat completely still for a very long time before she dared remove the pages inside, and beneath the dim yellow light of the hospital room, Miss Dott's handwriting appeared, trembling with age but arranged in straight, careful lines, just like the woman herself. She wrote that if Delaney was reading those words, then she must be somewhere that made talking inconvenient, and that Delaney shouldn't cry yet because there were still a few things she hadn't had the chance to explain. She wrote that she had known who Delaney was before she ever placed the bowl of soup before her. Not the name found in documents, but the person beneath it, because a woman who had lived 70 years could recognize the eyes of a soldier who had been left behind. She had chosen Delaney not out of pity, but because her house was missing a daughter, while Delaney was missing a home, and the two needs had fit together perfectly. Then the words turned toward something that made Delaney's heart catch between two beats. Miss Dott wrote about the boy in the suit who always sat at the corner table. Did Delaney truly think she didn't know who he was? She had recognized him from the first day he returned, from the way he finished every bite and never left so much as a crumb. A person could pretend to be hungry for pancakes, but no one could pretend to be hungry for warmth. She read the newspapers. She knew what people called him now, and how deeply the whole city feared his name. And she still served him pancakes exactly as she had served the little boy standing outside the window all those years ago, because people had pointed guns at one another often enough, and someone still had to keep setting food on the table. Delaney didn't know when the tears began falling onto the page. She turned to the final sheet, and there, in handwriting far more careful than the rest, as though it had been written on a day when Miss Dott's hands were stronger, came the old woman's last instructions. The red brick house, the restaurant, the faded blue finch on the sign, the recipe book, and everything else she owned would belong to Delaney. The documents had already been prepared by the elderly lawyer at the end of the street during the previous autumn, for the daughter God had sent 40 years late. Late was still late, but she had arrived, and Miss Dott no longer had anything left to hold against him. The woman who had stood without blinking before 3 gun barrels, the woman who had survived battlefields, betrayal, and 7 years on the sidewalk without breaking, collapsed against the edge of the hospital bed like a child. Her shoulders shook again and again, and the sobs she tried to hold back escaped without forming words. One hand still held the old woman's hand, while the other pressed the letter to her chest, because throughout all those days, she had believed she was the one protecting this home, never realizing that she had been the one the home had sheltered from the very beginning, the one who had been seen, called by name, and chosen as a daughter. Outside in the corridor, beyond the small glass window in the hospital room door, Ronan Ashford had been standing there for some time, still holding the coat he had meant to bring in for Delaney. He had remained motionless from the moment the letter fell from the book, watching the strongest woman he had ever known break apart beside the hospital bed of the woman who had set food before 2 people without homes. For the second time in his life, after the rainy night in the alley, he couldn't find a single word to speak. His hand only tightened slowly around the coat, as though he needed something to hold on to in order to remain standing. He didn't enter the room that night. Instead, he pulled a chair in the hallway close to the glass window and sat down, keeping watch outside while Delaney kept watch within. And so, in the deepest hours of the hospital night, 2 people who had never truly known what it meant to have a family quietly divided the 2 ends of the same vigil, guarding the sleep of an elderly woman who had taught them both that somewhere in this world, there were still people who saved a portion of food and kept a name waiting for someone to come home and claim it. In the days that followed, their lives divided into 2 halves. By day, there was the hospital, where Miss Dott remained lost in a long coma. By night, there was the cellar beneath the blue finch, the only part of the house left untouched beneath the ashes, and the place where they kept the only weapon they had left, the truth. Before leaving the hospital room each evening, Delaney always paused to look at the blue apron someone on the nursing staff had washed clean and folded neatly on the chair beside the bed, waiting for the day its owner would wake and put it on again. It was that image, more than anything else, that kept her heart from growing cold during the long nights spent turning through the papers of the dead. Ronan had battery-powered lamps and a computer brought into the cellar, the computer containing every piece of financial information his organization had gathered on Meridian Point throughout the years it had been lending the company money, and together they began the most painstaking work of all, comparing every yellowed file old Mr. Mercer had preserved against every transfer of money, every legal entity, and every name in Ronan's records. With each passing night, the picture grew clearer. The properties swallowed around the harbor all those years ago had passed one by one through shell companies, before being gathered under the corporation that preceded Meridian. The inspection company that had signed the report on Patrick Ashford's death was later purchased outright by Meridian and turned into an internal inspection division under Gage Hollis. And the manpower behind the dirty work carried out over 2 decades had come from a single provider, the private security company owned by retired Colonel Harlan Voss, the man who had signed the order erasing Delaney's identity years before. But the discovery that left the entire cellar silent was found inside the final wooden crate they opened, the one containing the Mercer family's private papers. There, Delaney found the last receipt old Mr. Mercer had received from the police station, dated the day he submitted a collective complaint on behalf of the entire harbor district, the thickest and most complete complaint he had ever prepared, bearing the familiar accepting signature of Officer Walton Byrne. Directly beneath that receipt lay a copy of Mr. Mercer's own death certificate, dated less than a month later. The cause was recorded in the brief, impersonal language of official paperwork: a fall down the stairs at the warehouse where he worked. No witnesses. Case closed. And on the line, naming the unit that had documented the scene, stood the unmistakable seal of the same inspection company that had signed the report on Patrick Ashford. Ronan read the paper 3 times, while Delaney sat perfectly still, because they had both understood something almost impossible to bear. The old carpenter hadn't died from age or misfortune, as the whole neighborhood had believed. He had been removed, cleanly and according to procedure, simply because he was the only person brave enough to gather the truth into one complete complaint. And for more than 20 years, Miss Dot had lived directly above the cellar that held the real reason her husband never came home, wiping the table he had built, preserving the knife he had carved, never once knowing the truth. Delaney closed her hand around the walnut-handled knife in her coat pocket, and inside that smoke-stained cellar, 3 names formed a single straight line running through 2 decades. Voss supplied the hands. Gage carried out the work and signed the papers. Vaughn took the land and the money. That machine had ground through Patrick Ashford, through old Mr. Mercer, and through Delaney's career and identity. 3 people at 3 different moments in time, united by one thing. Each of them had stood in its path. Ronan rose to his feet, and Delaney waited to hear the order that everyone in the underworld would have considered inevitable. Instead, he looked at his father's file for a long time and said something entirely different. His father had chosen the path of petitions and justice, and the entire city had called him insane. If Ronan now used the methods of darkness to bring this to an end, then the city would have been right about him. No, this time, they would do it the old man's way, with one important difference. This time, the truth wouldn't be left inside the drawer of any police station. It would be exposed in the most public and deafening place possible, where no one would have time to bury it. And what place could be more perfect than the gala Vaughn was urgently preparing to announce the groundbreaking of Lakeshore Crown, where he had personally invited the press, public officials, and investors from across the city to serve as his audience? The plan needed one final piece: someone in uniform who was still clean, someone who could legally receive every piece of evidence at the scene, where nothing could be exchanged, hidden, or lost like the complaints from years before. Delaney immediately remembered the young detective who had supported Miss Dot by the elbow as carefully as though she were his own grandmother. The following night, in a small coffee shop near the hospital, Micah Doyle listened to everything, examined every document, and remained silent for a long time before the papers spread across the table. Then he raised his eyes, and the young police officer who had once been forced to lower his head while carrying out the order sealing the restaurant spoke with the voice of a man finally lifting a stone that had weighed upon his chest for years. I joined the force because I believed that when ordinary people filed a complaint, there had to be somewhere for it to go. You're giving me the chance to prove that. I'm in. The night of the gala arrived like a citywide celebration. Searchlights swept bright ribbons across the sky. A red carpet stretched from the lobby of Meridian Tower all the way to the curb. Luxury cars lined up one after another. And while the magnificent grand hall below steadily filled with expensive gowns, tailored suits, and the ringing of champagne glasses, a shadow dressed as a maintenance technician quietly passed through the employee entrance at the rear of the glass tower, using an access card Ronan's people had arranged days earlier. Delaney had memorized the building from its blueprints to its shift schedules. She knew that tonight was the only night when every eye in security would be drawn toward the grand hall, where their employer was preparing to step onto the stage and claim his moment of glory. She knew the server floor was located high within the technical section of the tower, where Vaughn kept the one thing men like him never dared store in their private homes and never dared destroy: an electronic black ledger recording every unnamed payment made over the past 20 years. The insurance policy of one guilty man used to bind other guilty men to him. It was the final piece their plan needed, because old Mr. Mercer's files could tell the victims' stories, but only the black ledger could name the people who had paid for them. She moved through the building like water filtering through sand, blending into the catering staff on the kitchen level, separating from them in the service corridor, and taking the freight elevator to the technical floors. She passed every camera during the blind interval she had calculated from the security plans, disabling nothing and leaving no trace. A true ghost moving through a tower too absorbed in its celebration to notice her. The door to the server floor opened after 3 movements on the keypad, the code already included in the intelligence Ronan had purchased. Inside, rows of server cabinets hummed steadily and released waves of cold air. Delaney inserted the storage drive into the exact system Ronan's specialist had identified, and streams of data began pouring into it, year by year, payment by payment, 20 years of filth copying itself into a device smaller than her hand. But just as the progress bar reached halfway, the door behind her burst open, and a familiar, massive figure nearly filled the entire frame. It was Buck, the man who had fled from the kitchen that night and the same man who had poured the liquid along the walls of the Blue Finch. Gage had personally assigned him to guard the technical level during that exact shift because he didn't fully trust the building's regular employees. Buck recognized her immediately. The old terror flashed in his eyes, but this time an entire tower filled with allies stood behind him, and fear hardened into reckless courage. He pulled the metal baton from his belt and didn't call for help, because even he was standing in a place that held secrets capable of burying him. Then he charged. The fight unfolded between 2 narrow rows of server cabinets, brief and silent. Buck swung the baton with the full weight of his massive body. Delaney leaned aside, letting the blow graze the shoulder of her uniform, then used his momentum to twist his arm against itself. The baton fell, and the tip of her shoe knocked it beneath a server cabinet. He growled and came at her with his fists. She stepped back twice into the narrow aisle, where his size became a disadvantage, waited until his third punch reached its full extension, then moved inside the arc of the strike. One joint lock closed around his wrist, one precise blow struck behind his knee, and the huge man collapsed onto the cold tile floor, pinned on his side with one arm twisted behind his back. For an instant, he continued struggling to rise, until something cold touched his cheek. Buck glanced toward it and saw the small folding blade with the polished brown walnut handle. His body went rigid, and every trace of resistance dissolved like salt in water. Both hands opened flat against the floor in surrender. But the blade didn't move even an inch closer. It remained there only long enough for him to understand how thin the distance was between himself and the darkness, then withdrew. As Delaney tightened plastic restraints around his wrists and secured them to the base of a server cabinet, stuffing a piece of cloth into his mouth to silence him, she spoke in a voice of remarkable calm. The old man who carved his initials into this knife never used it to make anyone bleed. Neither will I. You'll stay here until the people carrying handcuffs arrive to finish their part. The progress bar reached the end. Delaney removed the storage drive, slipped it into the breast pocket of her technician's uniform, and had already traveled halfway down the corridor toward the emergency stairs when every one of her senses rose at once. At the far end of the hallway, a man had appeared between her and the exit. His silver hair was cut short in military fashion. His spine remained straight as a ruler despite his age, and his hands were clasped behind his back, in the stance she had seen thousands of times during her years of service. More than 7 years had passed, but when his voice came, every muscle in her body tightened. "Good evening, Silent Shadow. You still move as beautifully as the reports described." Colonel Harlan Voss had brought no soldiers with him. He had come alone, and that was more frightening than an entire squad. He looked her over from head to toe, with the gaze of a man evaluating an old asset, then spoke in the mild, generous tone of someone accustomed to granting favors. He knew what she carried in her pocket, and he had come to offer something she could have begged for on her knees 7 years earlier and still not received. One signature from him, and the old case would be reopened. A military court would clear her name, her service record would be restored, her medals returned, and the name Delaney Ward would once again exist openly within every system in the country. People would see her again. In exchange, He asked only one thing: place the storage drive on the floor and forget the path to the grand hall tonight. The corridor fell silent, filled only by the humming of the servers behind her. Voss smiled because he had studied her psychological file. He knew how 7 years of invisibility could wear away a human being. He knew that her name was the deepest wound of someone who had been erased. But the woman before him merely tilted her head slightly, as though she had just heard a weak joke, and her answer fell one word at a time into the cold hallway. You took my name from me, but someone has already given me another one, and it was written in crayon. Voss hadn't yet understood what she meant when she moved. She didn't retreat toward the emergency stairs as he expected. She charged directly at him, forcing the elderly colonel to abandon his stance and raise his guard. And at the exact instant his weight shifted from one foot to the other, she changed direction with the clean precision of a blade, slipped through the narrow space between his shoulder and the doorway, and vanished into the stairwell. Behind her came the sharp turn of military shoes against tile, and an offer that would never be spoken again, because she no longer needed it. The justice he had tried to use as bait was already in the breast pocket of her uniform. Among the black ledger's 20 years of corrupt transactions were the payments for the operation that had destroyed her life. Her honor was returning, not as a favor granted by another person, but as the inevitable consequence of her decision to stand with the truth. At the same time, on the other side of the city, the second part of the plan was moving toward the old rail yard. Before leaving, Ronan had stopped at the hospital, standing silently for a while beside the glass window as he watched Miss Dot sleeping among the tubes and wires, then instructed the 2 men he trusted most, in a voice that allowed no mistakes, that from that moment until morning, no one except the doctors and nurses was to pass through that door. Guard her as though you were guarding your own lives. Then he got into the car alone and drove toward the place he had avoided for more than 20 years. Their plan required Gage Hollis to leave Meridian Tower on the night of the gala, so Delaney would have an open corridor through which to move, and the only bait powerful enough to draw that old fox from his den on the most important night of all was the very thing he had been desperately hunting: the crates containing old Mr. Mercer's files. Ever since the fire, his people had searched everywhere to discover what had been rescued from the cellar, so information was released through the exact channels from which Gage regularly purchased his intelligence, claiming that all the files were being stored inside a shipping container at the old harbor rail yard and were scheduled to be moved during the gala, when every eye in the city would be fixed upon the tower. Gage took the bait, because a man like him couldn't allow those papers to survive another night. He arrived at the rail yard with 4 men, but Ronan's people were already waiting in the darkness, quietly separating and subduing each of them at 4 different corners of the yard. When Gage finally pushed open the rusted container door, he wasn't greeted by crates of documents, but by a man standing in the empty space within, moonlight slipping through a gap in the corrugated roof and falling across his charcoal suit. Behind that man, through the open end of the container facing the water, the old pier cast its crooked shadow over the black surface. Gage immediately understood whose board he had stepped onto. He stood still for several breaths, then released a dry laugh, and said that of all places, Ronan had chosen the rail yard well. Ronan didn't answer. He removed his jacket, folded it, and placed it on a wooden crate, then took the watch with the cracked face from his wrist and set it carefully on top of the jacket, as though performing a ritual. Then he spoke the only sentence he would offer before everything began. More than 20 years ago, at the edge of that water, a ship repairman who didn't know how to fight was forced to face the man hired to deal with him all alone. Tonight, we do it again, except this time, the man standing here knows how to fight. Gage drew a short metal baton from his belt, and the fight erupted inside the narrow container before spilling into the moonlit yard, brutal and relentless, between 2 men raised in schools without blackboards. Gage attacked with the vicious precision and stubborn endurance of someone who had spent 20 years cleaning up other people's problems. Ronan absorbed the blows with instincts tempered during years when he had fought empty-handed for every street corner he claimed. The first strike of the baton grazed his temple. He blocked the second with his forearm and answered with a blow that sent Gage staggering into the metal wall. They fought through leaning stacks of wooden pallets, steel striking corrugated metal, their breathing heavy as furnace bellows. The cunning Gage threw a handful of rusted grit into his opponent's eyes, and nearly succeeded with the sweeping strike that followed. But Ronan rolled across the concrete and avoided it. When Gage charged forward to finish him, Ronan caught the first mistake in the exhausted man's footwork. One intercepting blow sent the baton flying from Gage's hand. A second drove him backward into the container wall. The third, compact, heavy, and exact, dropped Meridian's cleaner onto the concrete, where he braced himself on one hand, gasping, unable to stand again. Ronan picked up the baton and stood over him. Gage Hollis raised his bruised face, looked at him, then did the last thing a man like him could still do. He laughed, spat onto the floor, and provoked Ronan in a broken voice. Do it. Pull the trigger. Finish it. Become exactly what this world made you, so I can see that the ship repairman's son was only a better version of me after all. The entire rail yard fell silent, leaving only the sound of water striking the supports of the old pier. Ronan looked down at the man who had signed the report that buried his father, the man behind the papers that closed the life of old Mr. Mercer, the man who belonged to the same machine that had destroyed the youth of the woman now moving alone through the glass tower. 3 debts had gathered into the single face lying at his feet. His hand tightened around the baton until his knuckles turned white. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lowered it and let it fall against the concrete with a sharp metallic clatter. He bent down until he was level with Gage's eyes and spoke in a voice colder than the water beyond the pier. No, my father doesn't need you dead. My father needs you alive. Alive for a very long time, watching everything you built over 20 years collapse one piece at a time, while you wear handcuffs before the cameras of the same city that once called him insane. Ronan's men entered and bound Gage, preparing to hand him over along with the 4 men already restrained around the yard. At that moment, a figure stepped out of the darkness behind the row of containers, with both hands raised to shoulder height and no weapon, and the entire rail yard seemed to freeze, because the man was Wade Corrigan. He had anticipated this move and arrived ahead of them, not to rescue Gage, but to gamble on the final hand of his life. He stopped 10 steps from Ronan, lowered himself onto one knee on the concrete, and spoke. 20 years, young master. I've followed you since you were sleeping in warehouses. I'm asking for one chance, one explanation. I owed an old debt to Vaughn's people. They found it, and I had nowhere else to go. Let me make it right, at any cost. Ronan looked at the man who had first taught him how to tie a necktie, the man who had stood behind him through every war, and the same man who had betrayed him 3 times, with the false message, the alley, and the location of the red brick house. He remained silent so long that each movement of the water could be heard clearly. Then he gave a signal. One of his men brought 2 glasses and a bottle of liquor from the car. Ronan filled both glasses himself, handed one to Corrigan, lightly touched the rims together, and drank his empty, as though 20 years of loyalty deserved to be laid to rest with one proper drink. Then he set down the glass and delivered the sentence in a voice no louder than the wind. Before sunrise, you will leave Chicago. Listen carefully. There isn't a city in this country, a harbor, a casino, or a market corner that will still have a place for you. I won't hunt you, but from tonight onward, the name Wade Corrigan no longer exists in our world. You will live. You will live a long time with nothing, somewhere no one knows who you once were. Corrigan bowed his head deeply, rose, and stepped backward 3 times in the old manner before daring to turn his back. As his figure was about to disappear into the darkness, Ronan's voice followed him with one final sentence, not angry, only carrying a strange and profound exhaustion. Do you know why you're still breathing? Because my father taught me never to kill the family dog. He taught me that when I was 8 years old, and tonight is the first time I've understood how difficult that lesson is to obey. Back at Meridian Tower, the gala was reaching the most dazzling moment of the night. The magnificent grand hall was packed with the most distinguished faces in the city. Reporters stood in long lines before the podium. The orchestra had just finished its final piece, and Prescott Vaughn stepped onto the stage amid thunderous applause, his cream-white suit without a single wrinkle, his charitable smile shining beneath the lights, completely unaware that his loyal cleaner was bound at the old rail yard and that his black ledger had already left the server floor. Vaughn spread his arms before the sea of people and declared in a grand voice that this was a historic night, that construction on Lakeshore Crown would officially begin, and that he was offering the city a jewel on the shore of the lake. Then he turned and personally pressed the button on the control pedestal to begin the promotional film on the enormous screen behind him. The screen came alive, but what appeared wasn't a vision of glittering towers created by computer graphics. What appeared were pages of documents. The first was a record of unnamed payments stretching across 20 years. Every line, every date, every figure, and in the column identifying the recipient, one name appeared again and again, causing a murmur to rise through the hall. Walton Byrne, accompanied by ranks that climbed steadily over the years like a second payroll. The next image showed inspection reports placed side by side, the fire at the auto repair shop, the prohibited goods discovered in the grocery store, the names of property owners following one another in a long procession, all bearing the same inspection seal and the same signature. Then came the hand-drawn map of an elderly carpenter, the marked properties converging one after another upon the name Meridian, displayed beside the Lakeshore Crown development map, hanging in that very hall, the boundaries matching perfectly down to the last line. The murmuring became gasps, and the gasps collapsed into stunned silence. Hundreds of phones rose to record the scene. Reporters pressed forward, while Prescott Vaughn stood petrified upon the stage, one finger still resting on the button, pressing it repeatedly in panic without changing the screen, because the presentation system had belonged to someone else before he ever tied his necktie that evening. The final page appeared slowly, a copy of a yellowed collective complaint, the careful handwriting of a carpenter, the receiving stamp of the district police station from more than 20 years earlier, and a sentence that grew larger until it filled the entire screen. This complaint was lost for 20 years. Tonight, it has reached the place where it belongs. Vaughn staggered backward from the podium, his frantic eyes searching the crowd for something to save him, and then he saw it. A middle-aged man in a gray suit, who had quietly appeared at the entrance to the Grand Hall, the representative of the Hidden Credit Council, the shadow creditors Vaughn had feared and depended upon his entire life. Vaughn nearly shoved his way through the crowd to reach him, crying out in a hoarse voice that they had arrived, that they had to listen, that this was slander, that construction could still begin, and that their money was still safe. The man in the gray suit looked at Vaughn with the expression one reserved for damaged merchandise, then slowly lifted his gaze toward the mezzanine, where a figure in a charcoal suit stood, leaning against the balcony railing and looking down. Before the entire breathless hall, the representative of the underworld inclined his head slightly toward Ronan Ashford, a brief and solemn gesture, the formal respect of that world offered to the man it had chosen. Then he turned and walked out of the grand hall without a word, leaving Prescott Vaughn standing alone upon the marble floor, one hand reaching helplessly into empty air. In that moment, every person in the hall understood something that required no explanation. Both the light and the darkness had abandoned him. Everything that followed happened with the speed of a flood that had been waiting behind a dam. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents entered the Grand Hall through 3 separate doors at once, led by expressionless officers carrying arrest warrants. Walking beside them in a perfectly arranged police uniform, a thick stack of files held against his chest, was Detective Micah Doyle, the man who had spent night after night with federal investigators, transforming every page from the cellar and every line of the black ledger into language the law couldn't ignore. Prescott Vaughn was handcuffed beneath his own podium and led across the Grand Hall through a forest of flashing cameras, past the magnificent Lakeshore Crown map, past rows of guests who had raised glasses with him only the night before, but now stepped away in unison, as though avoiding a filthy puddle. At the main entrance, Captain Walton Byrne, who had attended the gala wearing the finest police uniform he owned, was stopped at the threshold while attempting to slip outside. Before the cameras of reporters whom someone had carefully guided toward that exact corner, the captain's badge was removed from his chest by his own fellow officers. 20 years of betraying the complaints of ordinary people ended in a single gesture that lasted no longer than one breath. Not one bullet was fired that entire night. Not one drop of blood had to be spilled. Meridian Point's 20-year empire collapsed in the middle of its own coronation celebration, buried beneath the very truths it had tried to bury. On the mezzanine balcony, Ronan Ashford quietly watched it all below, the chaotic movement of the crowd, the screen still displaying the complaint written by an elderly carpenter, Micah Doyle clearly reciting the rights of the accused in the middle of the Grand Hall. The man who had spent his entire life using power to collect debts, punish enemies, and force others to lower their heads now stood with both hands resting calmly upon the stone railing, feeling something he hadn't known within his chest for more than 20 years. For the first time, the strength in his hands had been used to raise something decent instead of crushing something beneath it. And he found himself thinking that he wished the ship repairman from all those years ago could stand there for just 1 minute and see that at last, the entire city was reading his complaint. The following spring, the Halstead neighborhood welcomed a Saturday morning the entire street had been waiting for. Miss Dot had awakened in the middle of winter and recovered slowly but steadily, just as she had lived her whole life, and on the day she was discharged from the hospital, The entire neighborhood crowded onto the sidewalk outside the entrance, simply to wave their beloved old woman home. As for the red brick house, it had risen again from the ashes of its old foundation, every brick carefully laid by the finest craftsmen money could find to restore the building exactly as it had once stood. The blue finch had been freshly painted on the wooden sign, though the artist had skillfully preserved a trace of the fading left by time, and the upper floor of the house now carried a new name, engraved with dignity upon a small brass plaque, Mercer Community Kitchen, where every day the homeless people of the city were invited inside to sit at tables covered with clean cloths, and were served where they sat like honored guests. No one had to stand in line holding a tray. No one had to lower their head, because the rule of this house had never changed. No one leaves through that door with an empty stomach. That Saturday morning, the Blue Finch opened its doors again, and the laughter of children once more rang out around tall stacks of steaming blueberry pancakes. The neighborhood children crowded around 2 tables, pushed together, as though there had never been a single day without them. Little Poppy's new front tooth had finally grown in, and she grinned proudly as she showed her friends the drawing displayed in a wooden frame in the most honored place in the restaurant, the crayon picture of a woman in a moss-green coat, standing before a red house. The only thing Delaney had carried with her out of the fire that night, now protected beneath glass like a treasure belonging to the whole house. In the middle of the morning, the bell above the door chimed, and Micah Doyle entered wearing a new police uniform, the insignia of his recent promotion gleaming on his shoulders. He had barely enough time to raise a hand in greeting before taking his familiar seat, where a plate of pancakes was already waiting for him, as though he were family. Near noon, when the restaurant had grown warm with people, and the scent of butter browning on the griddle, Miss Dot wiped her hands, slowly removed the blue apron she had worn for 40 years, folded it neatly, then placed it around Delaney's neck and tied the strings behind her with hands that were wrinkled but steady. She offered no long speech. She merely patted twice the shoulders of the daughter God had sent her 40 years late, and the entire restaurant fell silent for one heartbeat before someone began to applaud. Then the bell above the door chimed again, and Ronan Ashford stepped inside without bodyguards or a line of cars, only a man wearing a simple sweater, whom the children had seen so often that they no longer bothered to look up. He walked directly to the counter, and with a slow gesture he seemed to have rehearsed in his mind for a very long time, he removed the mechanical watch with the cracked face from his wrist and placed it carefully upon the wooden counter, as though laying down an old life so both hands would be free to receive a new one. Delaney looked at the watch, still ticking with quiet endurance, then at the man standing before her. She turned toward the kitchen, and a moment later returned with a steaming plate of blueberry pancakes, placed it before him, gently pushed it in his direction, and said, "Help me eat these. I made one serving too many." And for the first time, before the eyes of the entire lively restaurant, the crime boss's smile reached his eyes. Their story ended there, amid the scent of pancakes and the laughter of children, but it left us with something worth carrying forward. People aren't invisible because they're poor. They become invisible only when no one is willing to look. And a true home isn't something we possess for ourselves. It is something whose doors we open and build for others, sometimes beginning with nothing more than a bowl of hot soup, a name spoken correctly, or a kindly told lie. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. How did this story make you feel? Which moment touched you most deeply? Please write it in the comments so we can hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. Thank you for staying with us until these final words. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness in every day, and lasting peace throughout your lives. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.